Hello! Today's stories come from r/ProRevenge. We've got two stories. First up, when someone tried to get you fired, but you have a reverse card. This incident blew up in March 2021 in the middle of lockdowns and stuff. It would probably be recognizable to people I work with. Hopefully they don't read this thread, huh? It's a story about someone whose ambition was bigger than their ethics and the law, and it coming back to bite them. It's a bit long, sorry. At the time, I was working as a manager in a mid-sized business. While I was there, I was assigned a new member to my team. I'll call her Evil. Evil was in her mid-20s and was pretty fresh out of college. She was the kind of person who could talk your ear off about all her ideas and plans and what she was working on, but never really seemed to have anything to show for it. When I talked to her about clients complaining that she wasn't getting back to them, she would always have an excuse about how difficult they were, how snowed under she was, and how she had written an email, but it must have gotten lost in spam, so on and so forth. Basically, never her fault. It got to the point where after one of our monthly meetings, I called her in and explained that if she couldn't get her tasks done, she needed to let us know so we could help delegate resources to make sure things weren't slipping through the cracks. I'll admit, I was pretty direct. Her performance was impacting the whole team, and my job was literally to keep the team on track. I get that people can be under pressure, that there can be stuff going on at home which impacts work, and that sometimes people need a bit of help. But if every time I ask about a project you say, yep, everything's good, I've got it under control, and then it all falls apart and your only response is to blame the client, we have a problem. I explained that I wasn't going to start formal performance management or anything like that, but from now on, I'd like her to check in with me on Monday mornings for 10 minutes to go over objectives for the week and to check if she needed support with any of her clients. I know it isn't fun to be micromanaged, so I tried to keep these check-ins short and mostly just offer assistance on stuff. She clearly hated my guts though, and apparently was hatching her own ProRevenge. Now part of my role included use of a purchasing card, which wasn't in my name but I had access to it. I was given the card to basically make small purchases for the office or spend up to $500 on clients. The card was kept in an office I shared with another team manager, where we both could access it when we needed it. One day, I get a call from accounts asking about a few abnormal purchases on the card. A Photoshop subscription, a couple of Uber Eats orders, an HBO subscription, etc. I say I don't know anything about them, and they should check with the other team manager. Apparently, the other team manager didn't know anything about them either because after the weekend, I get called into the big boss's office. After my colleague and I had denied involvement, accounts had started calling Adobe and Uber and stuff to find out where the transactions were coming from. They said that not only were the accounts in my name, they were registered to an email address with my name in it too. Example, word.roll3@domain.com or something. I can't describe what it felt like to be in that meeting. I felt physically sick. I couldn't work out what was happening. I was so shocked I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was about to get fired and I couldn't understand how that was even possible. The director was going on about how access to the card was a privilege, and that I had signed an agreement about appropriate use and so on and so forth. I denied that I had been using it inappropriately, and the boss listened, but I could tell he wasn't that convinced. To be honest, in my head, I was gaslighting myself and worrying that I had somehow saved the card in Google, and maybe my wife had been accidentally using it or something. It was terrible. I found myself apologizing and saying, I don't know how this happened. I assure you that I know that none of those expenses are appropriate uses of company funds. There must have been some kind of mistake. Can I please have the details and look into it? Etc., etc. When I finally got out of that office, job still intact, barely, Eva was waiting for me at my office door. She was grinning from ear to ear and sweetly explained she had been waiting for our morning meeting. I told her something had come up and we'd do the meeting tomorrow, and she said, "Oh, will you be in tomorrow?" Confused, because I didn't know I was in a ProRevenge thread at the time, I just replied, "Yes, why would I not be in tomorrow?" And she just sipped her tea and said, "Oh, no reason," turned around and went back to her desk. Something felt off, but I was still worrying about what had happened with the boss, so I spent the next couple of hours calling my wife, calling Adobe, and doing the same legwork that accounts had done. It became very obvious that someone had been using my name and the company card to spend a bunch of money online. Had I been hacked or something? Personal info on the dark web and these hackers just really wanted Photoshop and Wendy's delivered? It was the Uber Eats that was her undoing. After getting on the phone and talking through what had gone on, and obviously giving my name for the account and everything, The fellow on the phone told me where the food had been delivered. It was in our city, which made me rule out straight away any notion of my data being sold online or something. Now I was suspicious and pissed. I don't like to think the worst of people, but now I was. Listening to my gut, I pulled up Evil's employee information and checked her address. I pulled it up on Google Maps, dropped a pin on her place, and then looked for the address Uber Eats had given me. It was the corner of her effing block. I was furious. When she left work for the day, I got IT to give me access to her laptop. Sure enough, when I opened up her domain.com account under her listed accounts, was word.roll3@domain.com. There were some things she had been smart about. The IP address she had been using was the office, which would have tied back to me. She had even had the food delivered to a different address. She had even made a fake email address. But saving her passwords on a work computer was a mistake. I called the boss that night and explained what I had found, and kept the IT guy with me to support the fact that I hadn't just logged into her computer and made it all up. The next day, the boss called her into the office and fired her so bad there were red trucks lining up outside the building. When she teary-eyed left his office, I made sure I was standing in the hall sipping a cup of tea. It had gotten cold while I waited for her, but still tasted sweet. I hope she went home that night, because if she did, she would have received some nice goodbye Wendy's delivered by Uber Eats, paid for on my personal card, of course. Revenge and justice can be the same thing, right? In the end, she was fired. The boss apologized, and we were on good terms when I left in October for a new gig. She never apologized, and I haven't seen her since. The boss decided not to get police involved, and neither did I. Just didn't want the hassle. The title really says it all in this one. Evil's plot totally backfired. Literally. She was too lazy to do her work, but not too lazy to try screw over OP. I hope she enjoys her Wendy's. And now onto our second and final story. Turnabout is always fair play. I'm not sure if this one belongs here, as I was not the one actually wronged. My revenge was taken for someone I have never met, and I honestly don't know if they personally got any satisfaction from it. I do know what it did to the perpetrator, and that it satisfied me, so I'll let the readers decide. Like many of my tales, this one takes place in the distant past, before cell phones were common, and before universal caller ID was the norm, in a time dinosaurs most likely roamed the earth. Well, the 80s at least. These things are very important to this story. Our tale takes place in a large West Coast city known for a big orange bridge and delicious sourdough bread. I was living in the city for several months working temporary duty for my company and was preparing for work on the day in question. As was my custom, I was getting dressed listening to the morning radio show on a local station. This station's jocks had started doing something called the Monday Morning Wake-Up Call, where, on the first day of the week, they would make a prank call on the air to a victim chosen from write-in suggestions from the listening audience. Doing this was actually very controversial in radio circles at the time. I had been a radio DJ in my hometown for a few years, and there are rules you must follow. One of the biggest rules is that you can't make a false or deceptive radio transmission, like announcing an emergency, sending an SOS, or cry for help, or other such deceptions. Doing so is a federal offense. You can lose your license and be fined or even do jail time. It's a big no-no. The debate has long since been decided, but at the time, doing prank calls on the air was a gray area. There were people who were sure it constituted a false transmission, and some stations refused to do it. The argument was still alive at the time this happened. This day happened to be Monday, and the intended victim had been nominated by her husband. They had experienced a power failure at home earlier in the week, and the husband's suggestion was that the station call his wife, claim to be from the utility, and tell her that the power outage was somehow their fault, and they would have to pay for it. The station staff loved the idea, and they proceeded to call the wife at her place of employment, a local bank. The victim answered, and the prank began. "Hello, is this Mrs. Victim? I'm John Doe from Area Power Company. Do you remember having a power failure earlier this week? Well, it was due to a blown transformer on your block, and we've determined that the cause is a wiring fault in your house. We may have to cut off your power until you get it fixed. Also, you will be charged for the transformer. The total cost is X thousand dollars. Would you prefer we put that on your utility bill, or do you want to make other arrangements to pay?" As you might imagine, the woman was shocked, then scared. As she asked for more information, having trouble believing that they were going to have to pay thousands of dollars, she got increasingly more upset. This egged the radio staff on. The guy making the call kept increasing the pressure on her more and more, eventually telling her that her power would likely be cut off until payment was made, and that there might be a lawsuit. After several minutes, she suddenly hung up in tears. He called her back, and when she heard his voice, she hung up again, crying even harder. This time, the guy waited a minute, and then called back again. Another lady answered the phone, a coworker, and he asked to speak to Mrs. Victim. When the coworker asked his name, he replied, "This is her husband," distinctive first name. The coworker cursed at him, called him a liar, and hung up. The radio studio was filled with laughter. The jocks thought it was hilarious. They took calls from listeners who were all laughing and talking about what a great prank it was. They finally got the husband on the phone, he of the distinctive name, and he was also laughing and joking that he'd surely be sleeping on the sofa tonight. He was congratulating the radio staff on the fine job they had done terrorizing his wife. The radio host promised the listening audience that, because the prank was so funny, they would certainly be playing the whole recorded prank again at noon. So, be sure to be listening and call your friends. I, in my efficiency apartment listening to this, was getting mad. I was still pretty newly married and couldn't imagine doing something like that to my wife. All I could think of while the staff and listeners on the radio were laughing was that, a few miles away, a young woman was in the ladies' room crying, probably with coworkers trying to calm her down. What made it worse to my mind was that this guy who set her up for this was the one guy in the world who should have had her back, her husband. Anger turned to resolve. Resolve formed a plan. I grabbed the city phone book, remember, it's the 80s, and looked up 2 phone numbers. I called the first one. You may remember that I said I had been a radio disc jockey myself. It was a tiny, dawn-to-dusk station, but I knew how stations worked. I knew what they liked, and more to the point, I knew what they did not like. I also had done a lot of voiceover work and could sound professional as heck. The phone rang and was answered. "You've reached K, radio jerk." I launched my attack, me, in a very professional voice. "Yes, this is George Smith." I picked a more believable name. "From the city office of the Federal Communications Commission. I've been getting some disturbing calls about your morning radio show, and I need to speak to your program director to discuss it." The first radio guy was stammering. He's not, here right now. Let me get you someone else." I was put on hold. After a few moments, the second radio guy, also stammering. "Hi, hello? This is Radio Guy 2, you're from the FCC?" "Yes, this is George Smith from the City Office of the Federal Communications Commission. As I told your coworker, I've been getting some disturbing calls about your morning radio show, and I need to speak to your program director to discuss it." There was a short silence. He's not in yet. He'll be here at, 9 o'clock. "Okay, well, I can start with your station manager since he will need to be in the conversation as well." The second radio guy, breathing fast, starting to lose all his composure. "Oh, wow, he gets in at 9 too. I can have him call you." He half-asked and half-pleaded. Me, letting out what I hoped was a bureaucratic-sounding sigh. "Oh, very well. I will expect to hear from him at 9. I will need to speak to your station manager, your programming director, and very likely your on-air personnel from this morning. I'll also need your station logs." "Oh, yes, sir. I'll make sure he calls you right away." "All right. I'll be expecting his call. Here's my number." At this point, I gave Radio Guy 2 the second number I had looked up in the phone book, the main number for the city office of the Federal Communications Commission. Radio Guy 2 stammered his thanks and promises of phone calls, and we hung up. I went back to the radio. The disc jockey was going off. "Uh-oh, the FCC is calling. Well, they can't do anything to me. I've got a year of pre-law in college and blah, blah, blah." He continued his defiance for a few minutes and then went to commercial. I kept listening. They stopped talking about the prank call. They stopped taking phone calls from listeners. They stopped talking to the husband. They started playing music. A lot of music. I listened for the rest of the day. They didn't talk about it the rest of that day, and they didn't replay it at noon. In fact, for the rest of the week, I listened and heard nothing about it. I was a bit surprised. I figured that they might stop talking about it for a little while, but not altogether. It wasn't until later that I realized why they went so silent. I had scared them. In my quest to get a little vengeance for that crying woman I'd never met, I scared them, but more to the point, I'd embarrassed them, and Jerk Disc Jockey had helped. Once he went live with his bravado against the call from the feds, their listeners knew they'd been called and heard the silence afterward too. They were embarrassed because I had just done to them what they had done to her, and they didn't want to have to admit it. I've kept the rather distinctive name of the husband a secret because I've always wished that I could meet the poor woman, and that name would be how I would know it was really her. I doubt she is still married to the guy, but I'd like to let her know that in that place, on that day, someone had her back. This is lovely. The prankster got pranked and embarrassed in front of his own audience. Also, it's kind of hilarious how the husband never resurfaces again. OP wondered whether he was in the doghouse. I kind of wonder if he's buried under the doghouse after putting her through that. Jeez. If you've enjoyed the story and would like to hear more, consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Thanks, and bye for now.